Hello, everyone. Welcome back this afternoon. So, very happy to be introducing Ned Block, a Silver Professor of Philosophy, just down the street from us at NYU. Thanks, Ned, for coming uptown to here. So I've learned many things from reading Ned's work over the years. The first thing I ever read from him was on the recommendation of his former PhD supervisor, Hilary Putnam, over 20 years ago. Putnam told me that if I wanted to read an exemplary instance of public philosophy, I should read Block's criticism of the bell curve, a best-selling book that posited a connection between race and intelligence. Ned's criticism takes the form of disentangling the book's conceptual confusions, chief among them its conflation of heterability and genetic determinism. Fast forwarding to more recent times, the not quite last thing I read by Ned was his epic 2023 book, The Border Between Seeing and Thinking. Here's my one-sentence pitch. If you're at all curious about what might make the concept of iconicity, what light it can shed on the architecture of the mind, then you must read this book. So today, Ned is going to continue his long-standing engagement with questions about AI. The title of his talk, as you can see, is Can Only Meat Machines Be Conscious? So for everyone from the New School who's attracted to Hans Jonas's view that life is essential to mindedness, I suspect that this talk will be essential listening. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Zed. Let me, first of all, pitch. The book that he mentioned is a free download from OUP. You can get it on the site. They hide the fact that it's a free download, but there's a lock that's open, and if you click on that, you get the free download. So let me say a couple of things. First of all, that Putnam was my advisor as an undergrad as well as a graduate student. I started taking courses with him as a sophomore in college. He was an amazing figure. Okay, so getting into the talk, I'm happy to have questions at any point. You don't have to wait till the end. Okay, so the title is Can Only Meat Machines Be Conscious? The important thing here is I'm trying to raise doubts about the view sometimes called computational functionalism, that says that certain kinds of computations are sufficient for consciousness. So I don't have any kind of a real knockdown argument against the view, but I'm trying to raise a doubt and raise the possibility that maybe something to do with the subcomputational properties might be relevant. Officially, I'm just arguing, by the way, this talk will come out in an article in the journal Trends in Cognitive Sciences, which is this wonderful, if you haven't seen it, you should look at it. It's a wonderful interdisciplinary journal where philosophers write and scientists write, and it's really unlike philosophy journals in the sense of it reaches a huge audience and is worth looking at. And they take a heavy hand on trying to make everything intelligible. So you get very serious reviews that are directed not only towards the content, but of making things intelligible with the glossaries and stuff like that. So if you're at all interested in issues on the border of science and philosophy, it's a great journal to look at. Okay, so just a sort of preliminary, the issue of AI welfare has come up a lot recently. And this is an article called Taking AI Welfare Seriously. If you don't know about this, there's a spate of articles that look like this, where there's a whole bunch of authors, and they're published on arXiv. And they have no intention of submitting them to a journal. It's, you're just supposed to know about these things on arXiv. And this one is very influential, and it's about the the issue, arguing strongly for the idea that AI should be thought of as a moral patient, as as a thing which has moral properties that we have to respect. And one point it makes is that even if AI machines are not conscious, they may still have moral properties because of agency. Is that frustrating their intentions might still be morally bad. So I just want to say that the stifling of AI agency might still be important even if they're not conscious. But that's kind of an aside. Here is a plan of the talk. I don't know which of these things I should be pointing at, but I think,
Look at either.
yeah. Okay, so I'm going to first say what I mean by meat. I'm going to talk about function, functionalism, and something called substance independence. I'm going to talk about meat-friendly theories of consciousness, electrochemical processing. Hold on, I should keep my eye on the time. So I can adjust how much time I spend on any of these things if we want to have more of a discussion. So first of all, I'm going to assume that consciousness has causes and effects amounting to a functional role within the body. Okay? So that's going to be a basic assumption. I'm not going to be some kind of epiphenomenalist or something like that. Here is a sample functional role, just a common sense functional role. We have the experience of red caused by seeing a red light. The thought that causes the thought that it's red, which causes the person to say it's red and to press the brake. Okay, that is a functional role. Those are all causal relations. Here is a more scientific one. This is the front of the brain, the back of the brain. For those of you who don't know, the visual system starts in the back of the head. There's a pathway between the eyes and the back of the head. That's the first cortical area that processes visual signals. So maybe one function of consciousness is to send the perceptual contents in the back of the head to thought processing in the prefrontal cortex. And that is arguably one function that conscious perception has. So that would be a more scientific kind of role. So the idea of meat is that it's our biological implementation of the functional role, and that can be at different levels. That's what I mean by meat. Importantly, I'm talking about mechanisms, a mechanism that realizes these functional roles, not just what something is made out of. Yes, so the question is, could there be consciousness with a non-meat implementation? So this is the point I just made. It's not about what it's made out of, but how it works. Now, here is an objection that might come to mind, is that neuroscience and biology more generally are computational, so both meat and non-meat implementations of any role will be computational. There's no big difference. So the point I want to make here is a point often made, which is that a computational implementation of a rainstorm need not be wet. Similarly, the computational implementation need not replicate the wetness properties of the rainstorm. The computational implementation of a neural process need not replicate the conscious properties of that process. So typically, a computational description can describe a neural process without implementing it. Okay, that's the key point. If you're not convinced by this, think about gravitation. This is the Newtonian formula for universal gravitation. The force of one object, if you have two objects, two masses, the force they exert on each other is a product of the gravitational content, the gravitational constant times the mass of one times the mass of the other divided by the radius between them squared. You could compute that all day and never get any gravity. Okay, so that computation does not produce gravity, it's a description of gravity. So, of course, in a field in which computation is the currency of contribution, it can be easy to lose sight of the fact that there's more to the working of the brain than the computation itself. So here is another one of these articles by a similar cast of authors arguing for consciousness in AI. And they say our method for investigating whether current or near future AI systems might be conscious is based on three assumptions. The first assumption is computational functionalism. Implementing computations of a certain kind is necessary and sufficient for consciousness, so it is possible in principle for non-organic artificial systems to be conscious. That's what I'm questioning. Is that assumption that is very often made in discussions of AI consciousness today. Let me say, by the way, that this issue of AI consciousness is not just an ivory tower issue. I had a visit yesterday from a guy named Mustafa Suleyman, who is head of AI at Microsoft. And he and another colleague of his are extremely concerned about the issue of AI consciousness. I mean, you know, one reason they're so concerned is because they're concerned that there will be over-attribution of consciousness. And the basis for this is that if you look at the way these large language models work, you can see that, you know, as people say, that the basic operation of them is mere pattern completion. And furthermore, that there is something that they call vibe coding, which is you can just put instructions in English for one of these models. You can have your own version of it, and people will be doing this. And just tell it to simulate a certain kind of person. It's already true that the vast majority of uses of AI today are uses as a companion. What?
We spoke about this a lot here.
Yeah. I mean, it's a scary business because people are really convinced that they're talking to a conscious being. And, you know, of course, one worry I'm guessing behind the lines there is that to the extent that people think that, then there will be restrictions placed on Microsoft AI. But in any case, they have a real legitimate, I recommend this article. If you look up Mustafa Suleyman, the guy has a blog, and his recent blog posts talks about this issue in a very sensitive, philosophically sensitive way. Of the issue of how to think about this over-attribution of consciousness to machines. And you know, philosophers need to be thinking about this much more. It's a really important social issue. And then the issue of whether they really do have consciousness and or could, and you know, how we should treat that. Okay, so. These people argue that there's no biological necessary condition. What I'm trying to motivate is the idea that there might be a biological necessary condition. So I'm symbolizing that with the X over the meat. So importantly, I'm not arguing that computational functionalism is false, but only that its falsity is to be taken seriously and is in the realm of serious possibility. And that is a really important thing. Notice that I'm not suggesting that any kind of biological property is sufficient for consciousness. Coma patients have much of the meat machinery intact, but they're not conscious. I'm really talking about whether it's a necessary condition. So now here's an objection. If we can identify what biological processing is doing, we can find a non-meat way of doing it, so meat isn't required. But the issue here is an ambiguity in what biological processing is doing between a role and the realizer of that role, or if you like, between a computation and the sub-computational machinery that implements that role. You can talk in either one of these two ways. In 2002, I wrote a paper called The Harder Problem of Consciousness, in which I made a big deal of the fact that you could, in the operation of any machine or person, you have to decide whether what's really important is the role or the meat that implements that role. And we have not really gotten very far in saying which of those two things is the basis of consciousness. So here's the roles. I mentioned these roles before. And the realizer is the physical mechanisms that do that role. So importantly, if it's the role that counts, then these creatures that have similar roles to us will be conscious. All functionally similar beings will be conscious. If it's the realizer that counts, maybe not. Maybe it will be, say, all mammals, or even wider, all vertebrates. And there is some reason to think that maybe invertebrates may not have some of the properties that are required for consciousness. I should say that one of my messages here is there are a lot of people now who are talking, who are thinking a lot about animal consciousness, including insect consciousness, and I think what is not widely realized is there really is an opposition between animal consciousness and AI consciousness. You know, there are a lot of people writing today who just want to expand the moral circle. So they'll think about the rights of AI, the rights of animals. These things are in conflict. If you go with the functional roles as what's important, then you will be thinking, oh yeah, AI consciousness, maybe so. If you go with the biological realizers, you'll be thinking, oh, maybe insects. So it's important to realize that there are these really quite different considerations militating towards a different attitude towards which creatures are conscious. And so that's really basically my basic message. So unfortunately, without a theory of consciousness, we can't know whether it's the role or the realizer, and we're not doing that well in coming up with a good theory of consciousness. Now, some philosophers may be thinking, well, all properties are functional, defined by their causal relation. Sidney Shoemaker said this. So the issue really is the right level for characterizing consciousness, just as the issue of whether a simulation of a rainstorm is wet is a matter of level. The right level is the role or the realizer of that role. Of course, this is a there'll be different levels, many different levels, not just two. Okay, so functionalism, substrate independence. I don't know why that keeps happening. So I'm just reminding you, computational functionalism is that, and that's not the same as the issue of whether consciousness has a function. These things are often conflated in the literature. Because the reason it's a conflation is because perhaps just imagine that a function of consciousness is to motivate, to seek or avoid things, or to promote cognitive access. Those are hypothetical functions. It could have this function only because of the meat implementation. So having a function and functionalism that says that that function is what makes the thing conscious, those are two different ideas. And they're philosophically different, conceptually different, and it's really important to distinguish them because, many people think if you're going around being anti-functionalist, you're saying, oh, consciousness is epiphenomenal, it doesn't do anything. That's really not what is at issue here. What's at issue is that function the necessary and sufficient ingredient for consciousness? So it's important consciousness has a function, does not entail computational functionalism. So that's the function I mentioned before, but maybe a non-conscious being could have the same function, okay? Maybe I'll pause for a second. Any questions so far? Yep?
I didn't quite catch the part about the levels of function.
Yeah, so here's the thing. So you can have a computational mechanism. You can have some sub-computational properties, but you might think of those sub-computational properties as themselves executing a kind of, being themselves functional, computational, and then maybe there's a lower level. So these things are all relative. I'm acting as if there's only two levels, but it is, you could be more fine-grained. I don't know if it'll help conceptually to be more fine-grained, but I think we'll have to leave open that possibility. Any other questions? Okay, so I'll just go through this quickly. Does consciousness have a function? No. Well, I think that's very unlikely. Why would we have it if it didn't have a function? We'll get into the evolution of it, but presumably it does something, and we have intuitive evidence that it does. But if it does have a function, that function could be multiply implementable. If yes, then if only the meat implementation is conscious, then functionalism is false. On the other hand, maybe it isn't multiply implementable. Maybe there's only one way of making a conscious being, and maybe that requires meat, in which case functionalism is also false. So there are those sort of two pathways for functionalism to be false. We could call this one substrate independence of function, and this one substrate independence of consciousness. I'm just mentioning this just to get these ideas on the table. This may be more tractable. This is, like this hard, terribly hard problem. So just to be clear, the distinction is often made between simulation and implementation. So simulation just duplicates the input-output of a process, and implementation duplicates the input-output plus intervening processing. And that's where the level comes in. It's the intervening processing at what level. So simulation of a rainstorm need not be wet, but an implementation at the right level would be wet. That's the idea. So here is a computational example, the really extremely simple computational example. The computational device I'm thinking of is an AND gate. What is an AND gate? An AND gate is something that has inputs and an output. If the inputs are both 1, then the output is 1, and all other outputs are 0. That's the computational level. What's the subcomputational level? Two AND gates that are computationally equivalent need not be the same in subcomputational properties. And here are two examples of AND gates. This is an electrical AND gate in which the switch being closed is a 1 and open is a 0. The lamp being on is the 1 output. If they're both closed, then you get the 1 output, otherwise it's 0, okay? And this is a mechanical AND gate. If you press just one of these things, the output 1 is these things going out, like in here. You need to press both inputs in order to get the output to the right side to go out. Okay, so it's a mechanical AND gate. And you can make an AND gate in many different ways. Those are the subcomputational properties. Note it's mechanism that we're talking about here, not stuff. So this is the computational level, this is the subcomputational level, and the thought here is, could some aspect of the subcomputational level be essential to consciousness? So the idea here is that meat implementations might be required for consciousness. This is a very weak claim that is extremely hard to evaluate, but important if true. So any questions at this point? Okay. I'll say a little bit about meat-friendly and unfriendly theories of consciousness. These are, yeah?
You had a question.
Oh, yeah?
I had a question about whether it's actually really bad if you have a relationship with AI. If, for example, you have like a pet fish and you have AI, you have companionship with the AI, but maybe not so much with the pet fish. Is that relationship actually bad and sort of what?
Well, I think it's dangerous to ascribe mental properties to something that doesn't have them. You know, you could get yourself into various kinds of trouble. It's not too hard to think of how that could go wrong. And of course, generally in our thinking about AI and what its social role is and what restrictions should be placed on it, it really does matter whether it's conscious. It might be useful for somebody to pretend it is for a while, but you can be very unhappy if your AI dies, or if some bad actor has programmed it to get you to do bad things. There have been plenty of cases of the AI companions making somebody do something or telling somebody to do something wrong. Any other questions? Okay, it's important if you're thinking about consciousness to look at the actual theories of what consciousness is. And I should say that these theories are all ones that are joint products of scientists and philosophers. So there are quite a number of philosophers working on this stuff now. And probably the theory that is most philosophical that is this higher order theory that says that what it is for a state, a perceptual state, for example, to be conscious is for there to be a higher order state, a state in another state that is about it. The global workspace theory, this is a diagram from Stanislas Dehaene, a French neuroscientist. And the idea of it is pretty simple. It's that what it is for a perceptual state, for example, to be conscious, is for it to be made available to so-called consumer mechanisms of reasoning, thinking, solving problems, reporting. So it's sometimes called global broadcasting. The biological theory is the one that I'm advocating, which is some feature of the biology. Then there's the integrated information theory, which says that consciousness of a system is a matter of how many possible states there are and how connected those states are to one another. So I have a bunch of slides on these things, but maybe I'll skip ahead. The thing is, these are all meat unfriendly. The idea is that, you can see, I'll just briefly go through this. They're all computational functionalist theories except for the biological theory. The global workspace theory doesn't say anything about how the global workspace is implemented. Any implementation is as good as any other implementation. The higher order theory, the best form of it, which is one that has been put forward by Hakwon Lau, who's a neuroscientist, but also Matthias Michel, who's a philosopher, is the view that there's a kind of pointer structure. That what makes a perception conscious is that there's some kind of a cognitive pointer pointing to it that says whether it's an image or a reflex reality or whatever. But those can all be implemented in anything. So there's no implementation requirement for these. The integrated information is famously implementation independent. It says that consciousness is a certain kind of structure, but anything can have that structure. So I think I'll skip ahead on this and not go through these theories. Okay. Let's see. So I'll just get to the biological theory. So the biological theory, the kind of thing that I'm suggesting, I'm not maybe advocating is too strong. It really goes back to Hobbes and Smart and Herbert Feigl. And the model is these theoretical identifications. Smart put this in the modern era in a paper, I think in the Phil Review in the 1950s, I believe. The model is water is H2O, light is electromagnetic radiation of certain wavelengths, heat is molecular kinetic energy, and the idea is you should think of consciousness in the same way as being identifiable with some kind of biological machinery. So the idea is that some biological features are necessary features of one sufficient condition. So the whole brain is a sufficient condition, but maybe there are certain parts that are a necessary part of a sufficient condition. And then the thought is that if that's right, then if we can find a necessary part of our sufficient condition, we may want to hypothesize that it's a necessary condition of all consciousness, which is a big leap, of course. Whether it's true depends on why it's a necessary part of our sufficient condition. So if meat is necessary for consciousness, there are two questions that arise immediately. Why? And what aspect of meat? The why question, I don't think anybody has a real clue on. The what aspect of meat, well, I have a suggestion, but I'll just mention some of the guesses. So Peter Godfrey Smith, a philosopher at the University of Sydney, I think, has suggested large-scale oscillatory signals. Some other philosophers have suggested electromagnetic field effects. There's a group of quantum mechanics people who think that it's something to do with quantum mechanically interesting structures within the cell. Ions crossing membranes, electrochemical processing, these things are all things that have been proposed as to a necessary condition. So I think electrochemical processing is a real possibility. So this is it's a wild guess, really. What do I mean by electrochemical processing? Well, every strong candidate for a phenomenally conscious being has electrochemical processing, and what is that? That is, we've got a presynaptic neuron. This is the axon of a neuron. Neurotransmitters flow between that axon and the dendrites of another neuron, and then the gates open, causing a current to flow down that neuron. It flows down, and then neurotransmitters are released, and that whole thing starts over again. So it's a really kind of bizarre setup that neurons communicate by these chemicals in a kind of soup in your brain. It's weird. You think that it should be something more electrical, but it's really chemical and electrical. So there's a possibility. Maybe it's that thing that is at issue. So notably, the argument isn't all known cases of consciousness have F, so F is a plausible candidate. So being made of carbon would be a bad candidate because we know that mere composition may not be fundamental to how something works. Being alive may not be fundamental. There are living things that are not plausible candidates for consciousness. Now some people say, oh, electrochemical process is computational too, but it's not clear that it is. It's clear that it can be described computationally, but that doesn't mean that it is computational. Of course, many non-conscious things lack that, but many non-conscious things also have electrochemical processing. This is a hydra. So I'm talking about necessity, not sufficiency. Now, I don't want to go on too long, but I have some evolutions. Well, first let me pause for questions. Yeah?
I would like to have more precision about the distinction you made between simulation and implementation. I'm not
Yeah.
sure I get it right. Is it possible that an AI just simulates a property or a personality or something in such a way that it reproduces mathematically the causal effect an actual implementation would have? Is it kind of...
Sure, it's possible, but it's also possible not.
Yes, but will it be still a description? In a way, just to be sure I understand you correctly.
No, if it has the right input, that's more right input-output relations. That's more than a description. And then the question is the underlying process one that should give us reason to think that there's some kind of consciousness in it? Now, current large language models, I have to say, if you look at how they work, it really doesn't look like there's anything conscious going on. The basic mechanism is next token, so-called prediction. And then there's reinforcement training layered on top of that. So they're just fancy versions of autocomplete. Now it's amazing what incredible intellectual achievements can be done that way. But I don't think there's any chance that these systems are conscious. And also, I don't even think they're reasoning. If you've looked at the literature on any of this, you'll see that they fail to have the properties of rule-based reasoning. this is a criticism, really made first by Steve Pinker, like it must be 30 years ago or 40 years ago. But I have another talk in which has a bunch of examples of this, but I'll just briefly mention. So if you expose, for example, some of these machines are really good at playing chess, but if you expose them to a very weird chessboard, they'll break the rules. So one example that some people have discussed is where the black queen tries to take the white queen by jumping over something. The thing is, these machines know the rules. They know the rules, but, in the sense that they're in the machine, the rules are there. But when it comes to pattern completion, they'll just disobey the rules because that pattern is so salient to them. Also, it's not often realized they're really not that good at arithmetic. So honestly, GPT-3 couldn't do two-digit multiplication. Now, last year with ChatGPT 4.03, I gave it a bunch of multiplication problems, 4 or 5-digit multiplication, but I found one that got the wrong answer to. They're not doing it the way a human would do it, where you do multiplication in a way that if you do it right, you're going to get the right answer. It is pattern completion. So so there's something wrong with so of course they can, score incredibly highly in a math Olympiad and stuff like that, but it just shows that there are just different kinds of processing. Sorry,
Yep, sorry, I just have 9 questions. So what do you think about the CL1 computer?
The what?
CL1 computer, like
CO1?
yes.
I have no idea what that is.
Brain cell computer.
What is it?
Brain cell computer.
Okay.
They use the brain cell with silicon clamps to build a new type of computational machine.
Okay, I've never heard of it. I don't know nothing about it.
Anyway, kind of news built by Colico Lab. But
Okay.
anyway, they use brain cell combined with the silicon machine. To
Okay.
do the computations.
Oh, I'd like to find out
Yeah.
more. Can you send me a link to that?
Yeah, sure, no problem. So
Yeah, that's more along the lines that I'm thinking about.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it seems to me the boundary between the meat and
Yeah.
non-meat seems
Yeah.
to be blurred
Yeah.
in this age.
Okay, well, I'd like to find out more about that.
Okay.
Yeah?
Yeah, I wonder if you could just say a bit more about Hobbes.
Oh, I don't know anything about Hobbes.
No, but I mean, because you identify him with the biological
Yeah, as a precursor, yeah.
account, and yet he also defines reasoning as computation. So I should have thought
Uh-huh.
it was more and in fact, Hoagland speaks of him as the founder of the anticipator of AI. I would
Yeah.
have been more in the computational functionalist.
Yeah, so maybe with regard to reasoning, I'm a computational functionalist about reasoning,
Okay.
but not about consciousness. So I think there are these different aspects of the mind that have to be treated differently. So reasoning, I think you can, it's reasonable to think that there is some kind of a computational story. And so I'd be a Hobbesian in that regard. But consciousness, I don't think so. Yeah?
On the last slide, you had mentioned plausibility, what makes something plausible for consciousness. I'm wondering where that plausibility comes from. What's the standard?
Yeah.
And how is that determined? Whether something.
So which thing was it that I said?
On the last slide, it said when something is plausible, or maybe it was.
Okay, I don't know. I have no idea which thing I said was plausible, but
Well, you said when you were just talking about when something is plausible for having plausible that it would have consciousness. How
Yeah.
are you determining, or how is it determined when it's
okay.
plausible?
There's no definition. First of all, when I say talk about consciousness, I'm talking about phenomenal consciousness, what it's like to feel something, that kind of thing. We are in a situation where we have no definition, no theory, and we have to kind of go by the seat of our pants. And that's really what all the literature about this is doing, is you have to make certain assumptions, judgments, and see if they turn out to be fertile. So if I speak about plausibility, that's something like that's what I have in mind, but I don't know which particular thing it was. Yep.
I'm in your pocket when it comes to biological meat, being
Uh-huh.
and electrochemical. But my question here is if life isn't sufficient, is it a mechanism that we use that being used to survive? So in other words, it seems to be like the functional mechanism for
Yeah.
its own survival and ultimate reproduction
Yeah.
as a candidate for understanding what the nature of it. I want to separate between consciousness and what human beings think of consciousness, because with AI, we don't compare with a bee playing around before it gets old enough to start having to work. That's part of consciousness that we do with human beings function. We think that we're going to replicate human consciousness with AI. So
Yeah, so look, I think consciousness is functional. It does something for us. Probably played a big role in our. I'm going to get to evolution in a second. So yeah, I'm on the same page as you on that.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, then can I get that one? And your entire critique has been epistemological, like.
Yeah.
And my question here comes in. I think of Aristotle, Plato. Aristotle mischaracterizes Plato, and what Plato really says is that you need to have things like for justice, you need to have universals. And so an AI would have to be able to act according to universals, which would be Plato would demand in order to be able to not get their values from money. So I'm playing with the idea that maybe we can't really answer this on an empirical level, empirical knowledge level, or epistemological level, and maybe we need to ask questions of consciousness in terms of justice or truth or beauty or something like that.
I think for truth and beauty, we want to know the real facts. If you want a notion of consciousness to play a moral role or an aesthetic role, you better find out what consciousness actually is. So I think that the important question here is really an ontological question. What is it? And of course, we have no choice but to be talking about in epistemological terms because we don't know what it is. Yep.
I went to a talk a few years ago at NYU where you were, and Mark Solms was giving a talk on,
Yeah.
and I forget what you said to him, but Mark Solms is a neuropsychoanalyst who did a study on hydrocephalus patients.
Oh yeah. He didn't do this study, but
Right,
yeah.
studied the studies.
Yeah.
So the whole discussion was, you have children born without basically a frontal cortex.
No, without a brain, without a cortex at all.
Right.
The extreme cases are no cortex.
Right.
Yeah.
That was interesting. But he maintained that they, he tried to prove that they were conscious. His
Yeah.
reasoning was that even though they didn't have the computational functions that a cortex would supply, there was the biological homeostatic mechanism. So I think his argument was that if you have computational functions that overlay a biological homeostatic mechanism, or perhaps is dialectically working with it, then that would together make up consciousness.
So this is where your question about plausibility comes in. So look, one of the problems in thinking about consciousness is you kind of want to start with which creatures are that we know to be conscious. And if you start ascribing consciousness to creatures that maybe are so different from the rest of them, where you may not, it could get you off in the theoretically wrong direction. Now, I myself think that there's absolutely no evidence that these hydrocephalic infants are conscious. I think the real rationale is they smile, they show signs of distress, but it's all subcortical. And of course, it's the fertility of assumptions and what they lead to that lead us. So far, people are doing much better thinking about consciousness in cortical terms, and these beings that don't have a cortex, may just be grimacing or showing, so some might all be kind of subcortical things that aren't conscious. Yeah, look. It's very hard to argue. It's very hard to argue about this because we don't have any firm knowledge on which to base an answer. But I wouldn't start the whole thing by by ascribing consciousness to a very questionable case. That's the main theories of consciousness are trying to look at the paradigm cases to see if they can figure out something on the basis of those. Yep.
I feel like your argument has been on the kind of functional side, but I'm wondering about the computational side. Like, is it possible that computation is just a different sort of thing than gravity, where actually it is actually implementation?
Is implementation independent? Well, that's certainly what. So I was just explaining that that's what these most of the theories think. They think that it can be described. That is those like global broadcasting. It's this being made available to cognitive mechanisms that make something conscious, or the pointer pointing to it. So I'm arguing for the opposite. I'm really what I'm doing is not so much arguing as to sort of raising the question of whether the subcomputational mechanisms might be what are really important. And it's a point of view that is neglected. The vast, there's a kind of juggernaut of AI trying to, lead us in the direction of conscious AI, and I'm trying to put the brakes on. Wait a minute! I'm trying to say, wait a minute. Let's yeah.
Just a quick one. I don't know how important it is. At the end of the day, it's probably not, but it's nevertheless interesting. Precisely because you just talked about the cortex and some of the more or less plausible intuitive judgments that you make, which I sympathize, right? Then add more structure to the meat, right? So it's not any meat, unless you would also be willing to entertain that consciousness might not be only in the brain. So we know there's a lot of neural tissue here. There might be many consciousnesses spread out in my body, etc. Right? So and I assume you don't want to go there. So that it's more than meat, right? So could you say? I mean, this will probably come up, but what's your take on the minimal neural correlate and is this restriction of, from all meat to some meat, how do you think this operates conceptually?
So you're thinking of these sort of embodied cognition views, I wrote a review of Alvin Noe's book on enactive, and you can find that on my website. I could go into something about why I don't like those views, but we have two visual systems. There is a system at the top, starting in the back of the head. There's the top of the head, and that controls action, but it's a largely or maybe totally unconscious system. That's what's mainly responsible for a lot of the actual behavior that we do. It's the so-called ventral system that's the conscious system. The trouble with these inactivist views is that the system that is doing most of that behavior is not a conscious system. So it really is, in my view, getting things wrong. And I think Alva, who's an old friend of mine, he's pretty much abandoned that stuff. He's now doing aesthetics. I don't think that embodied stuff is going very far scientifically.
No, my question was slightly more limited, right? Precisely, your response brings out, I think, rightly, that it's certainly not all the meat, right? So it can't be microtubules because there are microtubules everywhere, right? So it is certainly, some necessary meat plus some further condition. That's, whatever the form of the view.
Right.
Now the question is, why that part of the meat, right? So, why is it limited to, say, the cortical or whatever the right empirical theory of consciousness is? It seems to pose a further question.
It does. I agree. So I'm just going with what I think, anybody who studies consciousness and neuroscience would assume is that it's inside the head. We're going to get a lot of disagreement about any assumptions you make in this area. Okay, let me just say a little bit about evolution. So evolution. Okay, so this is kind of an interesting little weird thing. So this is, so we are metazoa. We are multicellular beings where the cells have somewhat different functions from one another. We're animals in that sense. Okay, as of 2022, this is the family tree of Metazoa, where it was assumed that sponges were the first animal, and then there's this one called Ctenophora, were a little more advanced, and Cnidaria, which is a little more advanced, etc. However, everything was changed in this picture of the family tree of animals in 2023. What happened? Oh, sorry. These are the two candidates for the first animals. Something called comb jellies, which are not true jellyfish. True jellyfish are these cnidarians, C-N-I-D. The difference is that sponges have no neurons, no gut. Comb jellies have all three. I think I have a slide on that. Neurons, muscles, gut, no neurons, no muscle. So, sponges are, really pretty primitive things. And so people kind of assumed that those were the first ones. But there was a discussion about it, and this is a diagram from a magazine article which expresses the two different theories. So you see comb jellies are here twice because people weren't completely sure whether they came before sponges or after sponges. Okay, so this is called the comb jelly sister hypothesis. The idea is that in evolutionary biology, sister means if sisters are descended from a common source, they're the closest extant relative. And this is the sponge sister hypothesis. Sponges first, comb jellies first. I mean, that's a crude way of speaking, but that's basically the idea. The ctenophore sister is a creature of which so that's what I just said. So what happened in 2023, there are two things that happened in 2023. One is a chromosomal analysis support the ctenophores as the sister to all other animals. The bizarre sea creatures, that's the ctenophores. Turns out the sponges are much more chromosomally related to us than to ctenophores. Ctenophores are an aberration. And so this is an article in Nature. The ancient gene linkages support ctenophores as sister to all other animals. And I won't go into the details, but the idea is that, true jellyfish, us were bilaterans, we form a group, a chromosomally unified group, whereas the synteny is chromosome scale linkage. There was a rare and irreversible chromosome fusion and mixing event that provides robust and unambiguous phylogenetic support for the ctenophore sister hypothesis. In other words, there was an irreversible change between those ctenophores and the rest of anything that could be called an animal, including us. So the ctenophores are aliens and sponges are part of our family. So what this article did was coin the term Myriazoa for the group containing sponges and us, and these cnidarians. Metazoa is a larger category, including the ctenophores, the alien ctenophores. Okay, everybody get me so far? All right, we're Myriazoans. That's the idea here. Bilateria is us. So it looks like sponges might have lost their neurons, or anyway, the neurons of ctenophores didn't seem to go anywhere, and the question is why? So it created a kind of puzzle. Why did ctenophores never, have any descendants that were sort of, more sophisticated version of ctenophores? Why was that? Why is that? And then the first article was in Nature. This is in Science. Science 2023 had an answer, or something, a part of an answer, which is this, I don't know how you pronounce this word, syncytial nerve net in a ctenophore adds insights. And what they found was ctenophores seem to have a purely electrical nervous system, a bizarre nervous system unlike any other animal. And this is a picture of it. Now, there are chemical interfaces to the locomotion machines in these things, but the internal network is entirely electrical. So it looks like a purely, I mean, this is, I should say, that this is one stage of the ctenophore that they could examine, and it's not known that all other stages are like this, but they think they are. So it raises an issue. What's wrong with a purely electrical nervous system? So it looks like the chemical form of bodily control in, like, one-celled animals, that didn't lead to complex organisms, but that suggests there's something wonderful about electrochemical form of control. What is wonderful might be, here's some hypotheses: inhibition, learning, and maybe some form of proto-consciousness. That's the sort of weird and crazy suggestion. So inhibition. Inhibition, I don't know if you're aware of this, but inhibition is just a fundamental neural mechanism throughout the entire brain. It's especially important in attention, where you inhibit some things in order to amplify other things. Now, the question is, you might think, okay, an electrical system can only excite, not inhibit, but that's not true. Electrical synapses can inhibit, so inhibition may not be what made the electrochemical processing so important. And the role of electrical synapses and chemical synapses is very nicely described historically in this book, The War of the Soups and the Sparks. So the soups not all neuroscientists are now soups, because they believe that the ways neurons mainly communicate is via chemicals. But in the early days, there was a battle between people who thought that that our nervous systems were entirely electrical. They're the sparks. And the key figure on both of them, both sides, is Eccles, who won a Nobel Prize for this work. So in the 30s, and I think in the 40s too, he tried to explain inhibition electrically. And he did. He had a model of how to do it electrically. But then, and this I won't go into it. Then oops, I'm skipping here. In the 50s, he showed that it was actually done electrochemically. So in any case, there's a lot of work on electrical mechanisms of inhibition. It doesn't look like inhibition could really be the main purpose of electrochemical processing. So maybe it's learning. Could that be? Well, we can study that by looking at the next step up the phylogenetic scale, cnidarians, which include real jellyfish. What about learning in them? So here is an article from 2023 also about learning in cnidaria. And what he found was, let's see, that cnidaria can do certain kinds of response, habituation and sensitization. Plants can do that, so that's no big deal. But very sparse evidence only sparse evidence of associative learning. So there's one classical conditioning study. So if you're aware, there's the most sophisticated kind of conditioning is operant conditioning, where an animal has a voluntary response, and that's reinforced either positively or negatively. Classical conditioning is the kind of Pavlov kind of thing. So it doesn't look like there's a ton of evidence for sophisticated learning in these cnidaria, with the exception of the box jellyfish, which came much later. So the cnidaria that would have been around at the time of this evolutionary period, which is like 600 million years ago, And ctenophores are actually much more complex than these early cnidarians. They have more specialized tissues. They have the locomotion. They have a through gut, whereas the early cnidarians are stuck to things and have a much more simple body plan. The hydra is an early cnidarian. Anyway, it's not clear why these ctenophores would have had why the early next stage up would have had an advantage. These two hypotheses don't seem to really. So that leaves the proto-consciousness one. I feel like I've gone on long enough. Maybe I should stop here.
Yeah, totally. Let's take over. I'm going to moderate that.
Okay, yeah. Yeah.
So please first of all, thank you. So please I'm going to go around and I'll write down people's names. Signal to me, make sure I make eye contact with you before you put your hand down. Who wants to start? And after that, who else? You should.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there are certain general indications that might be the case with this class of things. So I was understanding that if something is, if some process is dependent on a substrate, then that substrate would be a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the process to be implemented. But I'm wondering beyond that if you know if there are ways of sort of reading out of some potential thing which is substrate dependent, the fact that it is. Might there be certain general features of a thing that point to the fact that it can't be implemented except on a particular substrate, say meat, for example?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question, but I don't know of any general answer. I mean, so each case is going to be one where you have to see whether there's some other mechanism that could implement it. There's a wonderful article by Rosa Sau, who's a Stanford philosopher, on just how difficult it is to conceive of alternative mechanisms for many things that organisms do.
Just a quick question. I wanted to push back just a little bit on what we use as the template or standard for consciousness. And the reason why I want to do that is because of the implications for moral agency. So what are we using? You could argue that, I don't know, you have people who function, behave according to standards. You could say they're not acting consciously, they're acting because they're unconscious impulses. So my question is, it seems to me very important, what we use as a standard against which we would measure what qualifies as consciousness.
Yeah. Well, I think the hydrocephalus case you mentioned earlier shows just how difficult it is. I don't think there's a general answer to that. For specific cases, we have very good reason to think that certain processes are conscious and others are unconscious. So in these two visual systems, for example. So how do we know that the dorsal visual system is unconscious? Well, first of all, if you run on the beach and your feet avoid the stones, that you don't feel you're seeing, that does give you a clue that maybe the mechanisms that are guiding your feet are not, visually guiding your feet are not conscious mechanisms. But then the key thing are these brain damage cases in which you have lesions in the dorsal system or lesions in the ventral system. So lesions in the dorsal system, well, let's say lesions in the ventral system. It's a famous case studied by these cognitive neuroscientists, Milner and Goodale. And they have this patient who has damage to the lateral occipital complex. So she has no form perception. She can see color and shine, so something, but not form. But she has an intact dorsal system. So the technique they do is they show many cases where she can do something, she has visually guided action that works great, even though she can't see the thing she's doing. The case that started this is they have, you can have a tilted slot. And they give her a card and they say, they look at that slot, is it horizontal, is it vertical? She has no idea, right? She's almost a chance on whether the slot is vertical, horizontal, or tilted to the left, tilted to the right, but she can stick the card through the slot in a smooth manner. I actually have videos of this happening on my computer. So we have reason to think that the action guiding system is unconscious or largely unconscious. So in each case, there's no general answer. You have to look at the individual case and see whether you can find evidence one way or the other.
Brian.
Hey, so yeah, I was on the edge of my seat for the proto-consciousness section because it seems like it's the third proposal for what would make having like an electrochemical transmission. And I was like, maybe I could just ask the question of, could you just play the next couple slides or something, or explain it real quickly?
I don't really have much to say by way of justification of it. Mm-hmm. It's just a suggestion.
Gotcha. If it's not one of these two things, maybe it's the proto-conscious.
And then, the questions would arise is what good is proto-conscious? Is it really a kind of consciousness? So I don't have answers to that. Really, I am trying to just put the brakes on in the juggernaut of computational functionalism, which seems to have taken over.
Totally. Thank you.
Hi. I had a question about Godfrey Smith, and I saw you were about to get to it. So I was wondering if I could just prompt you to talk about what you had planned to talk about with respect to Godfrey Smith.
So let me sit down for a second. So Godfrey Smith thinks there are these, system-wide oscillatory activity that underlies consciousness. There is some good evidence for it. Now, especially in the vertebrate neural system, there's a big difference between vertebrate and invertebrate neurons. Vertebrate neurons have these axons that have many, 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 even 1,000 connections with the dendrites of other neurons. And no neuron is powerful enough to do that by itself. So you need population activity. You need some activity from a lot of other neurons to do it. And the only way that works is by brain rhythms, oscillations. Invertebrate neurons are largely not like that. So that, if you think that there's a larger chance of consciousness in vertebrates than invertebrates, that is a clue to maybe these brain rhythms are important. However, there are also evidence on the other side. Probably the most dramatic evidence is, in the 90s, the current era of studying consciousness arose from Francis Crick and Christoph Koch, who, in the mid-90s, and one of the things they argued was that oscillatory, they said 40 hertz oscillations were important to various kinds of perceptual phenomena underlying consciousness. And it was quickly pointed out that electric lights oscillate, or not all oscillate, but quite a few of them do oscillate at 60 hertz, because we have 60 hertz alternating current. And there are lots of kinds of lighting that involves oscillation. And it turns out that oscillation entrains brain oscillations. And they have almost no effect on anything conscious. You're not aware of them. They don't do much of anything. So there is some, it'll be tricky to figure out exactly what, what's important and what's not. But I think I take the Godfrey Smith hypothesis very seriously. And he's argued for it very effectively. So really, he and I are the main two, we're really the two philosophers who have explored this. There's also another person who's worked in this area and who has similar views to ours, is a cognitive neuroscientist named Anil Seth. And he has an article coming out on this called Biological Naturalism in this journal of Behavioral and Brain Sciences. I don't know if people know about this journal. Philosophers really ought to know about it because it is a fantastic resource. It's there are target articles, and then can be 30 people criticizing them, and then the author replies. And it's a really well done thing. And I've published 2 articles in it. A lot of philosophers ought to be aware of this because it's really very important to thinking about these issues to look at the right journal articles.
I've assigned multiple articles from that in my
Yeah.
seminar this fall.
Oh, good.
So there are people reading it.
Oh, good.
A quick question. You touched on this.
You touched on this when you were talking with Marcus in passing. I was promised at the beginning Hans Jonas, but it didn't pan out. So like in your decision tree, you had like either multiply realizable computational functionalism or meat machines, as if those are mutually exclusive. But on like, a Jonasian view, anything with the life-centered, as long as you're metabolizing, you've got an Umwelt because you're trying to stay alive, that could be silicon-based Martian or carbon-based human. So, but it still requires meat in the sense of a living organism. But you indicated that that's not really panning out scientifically. I'd just be interested in your sort of observations why it's not worth taking seriously.
Well, no one thinks that metabolism is sufficient for consciousness. And I don't really see much of it, as much reason to think it's necessary either. I mean, certainly on the theories of consciousness we have, global workspace, higher order, the IIT kind of thing, metabolism isn't necessary for any of those. I think there could be some version of an electrochemical system in a machine that doesn't have metabolism. I just don't see the rationale for it, really. I've never read this guy. Does he give a reason?
Well, Evan Thompson has the same view.
Okay. Yeah. Well, he's an activist. Yeah. Okay. I'm not a fan of activism, as you may have noticed.
Well, yeah. I feel like we're at that point in the conversation where now we're just asking, is there really a Santa Claus kind of thing? So I'll hold off, I think, on the question I wanted to ask you, but I'll mention it, which is...
About what?
Well, it's a story about why we ever came to think that thinking resides in the cortex, or indeed in the brain, or indeed in the head. In the ancient world, they thought it was the lungs, for example. And that's got to be a methodological problem in there. How we ever thought that a certain kind of empirical observation was a reliable way to even think about this problem. So that's a question you can take up if you want. But I decided after all the last questions, what I'd really like to hear about is what you have to say about the difference between sleeping and waking as a way of thinking about consciousness. In other words, since I share your desire to put the brakes on the computational functionalism way of looking at this, it seems to me one straightforward way of doing it would be to say, well, computers have a sleep function, but that's just a metaphor. They don't actually take a nap. And so is there a relationship between sleeping and waking that, as far as your thinking goes, is meaningful for thinking about the consciousness problem? If so, I'd like to hear what those thoughts are.
It's important to realize that sleep, even slow wave sleep, is often, in fact, very often accompanied by conscious experience. There are these dream labs where they wake people up. In fact, Tononi, the guy who does the what? Well, they wake people up, and in slow wave sleep, I think it's 70% of people who are awakened in slow wave sleep describe some kind of experience. Now, it's not the vivid, elaborate experiences of a REM sleep, but there are these experiential descriptions of what people have been experiencing before you woke them up. So it isn't sleep versus wake that's crucial, it's conscious versus not. So I think that's really, look, it's very significant what happens in these things. In fact, one of the arguments against some of the brain rhythm stuff is that when people are seemingly unconscious, the low frequency brain oscillations go way down. So it's a little hard to, we're in a pre-paradigm era on consciousness where there really are, for almost everything, there's evidence in both directions.
Marcus.
I have two questions. So one on, let's assume that this version of biological naturalism turns out true, and then there's something, which you haven't told us what you think it might be, subcomputational, something in the chemistry, of course, by definition, right? Now, the usual AI industry reply to any argument of the form, here's a limit to what you do, is to then just model it. So do you have an argument according, with the conclusion that if the view is correct, then you cannot build an AI, it's not going to be an LLM, it's not the transformer, right? That couldn't give you a computational model of what is ontologically subcomputational. So you might be inviting, Microsoft to then just build a new damn thing, right? The game has been played in this way. So it would be great to hear. And then maybe just a sub-question, what do you think is the right modal metaphysics for all of this, right? So part of the whole puzzle there is, right, when we invoke necessity, right, we get zombies, we get variation conditions, and we have absolutely no idea how to deal with that given the lack in knowledge. So, what's your take on this? Do you talk this away or? Yeah.
Look, you can model a rainstorm in a gross way. You can model the H2O molecules in a computer. You could model the atoms that make up the H2O molecules. You could model the quarks and other elementary particles that make up those atoms. All that modeling isn't going to get you wet. So I think that's my response. It is that there is a difference between the physical substrate and the computations that go into modeling it at every level. So, and that's the kind of break that I'm trying to put up here, is that modeling just doesn't entail the properties of what's being modeled.
But Ned, that's really quick. Sometimes you yourself have a gallop. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, fair enough, yeah. It doesn't require.
Why
is this the case where it doesn't?
I wrote a book about this 2015, so I've been defending this for a while with a variation. So I call my view biological externalism. You're working on externals material right now, but I think of this largely as a view primarily about language, but externalism always is, right? So I have a view very similar to this one, which I gave up in a way after that. I for a long time I thought the map and the territory argument would do the trick there. But then I think indeed we need an additional argument for why we're in that scenario, right? Because not in all cases the model is categorically distinct from the target system. Yeah. So, and we would need to know beforehand the truth of biological naturalism before the argument goes through. I think that's a problem.
I haven't seen this book.
I'll send you, it's called The Meaning of Thought. I'll send you a copy. And then I tried to repair the flaws in it in a book just out called The Human Animal. But I'll send this to you.
Okay, cool.
Right. Thanks again. I wanted to explore a bit further this whole revision to taxonomy that has taken place in the past few years, and in particular, the whole claims about stenophores, if I'm even pronouncing it correctly, the notion that there could be an entire a genus of animals with entirely electrically implemented nervous systems, and I'm wondering if there has yet been research to sort of draw out the implications of that in terms of seeing, can that be a potential ground for a computational functionalist view that something is purely electrically implemented, such that maybe the meat isn't, I'm vegetarian, so maybe the meat isn't necessary after all.
So you're saying maybe the meat is necessary because...
Might not, that the xenophore example of an all-electric system might suggest that the range of possibilities even within nature is wider than we had hitherto believed. And hence maybe electrochemical combination is not necessary.
Okay, but the ctenophore, it's unclear why the look, the question is, why didn't the ctenophore kind of system go further? Why aren't there more complex animals like that? And so what I'm suggesting is maybe there's something better about the electrochemical type of system.
Okay, we have time for one last question from over there. Come from over there.
Thank you very much. Wondering about your view on the role or function of symbolization when it comes to conscious processes. AI and human have it, some animals too. Of course, for AI, it is in a very different way than for living being, but it allows them to interact with being made of meat. So my question is there any place for symbols when it's question of conscious? For example, is it the kind of proto-conscious level you were talking about? Or on the contrary, talking about symbolization when it comes to automated system, is it falling into the computational functionalism you were against?
Yeah, so something like that is the topic of a recent BBS, Behavioral and Brain Sciences, article by a philosopher at Rutgers named Jake Quilty Dunn. And he and Eric Mandelbaum, who's at CUNY, have argued for the language, they're reviving the language of thought, Fodor's language of thought, as applied to perception. So they argue that the role of language or language-like symbols in the mind is very much stronger than people have been thinking. So there is that view. I have a reply to that in that same journal article, and there's a real debate about that. It's a super interesting question.
Okay, thank you so much.